Hi, my name's Andrew Dudley, and this is Earth Live, a webcast featuring interviews with people working on the front lines of conservation. Today we're joined by a real conservation hero, Mike Korchinsky from WildLifeWorks, who's joining us from, well, actually around the corner, San Francisco. Hi Mike, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, Andrew. Nice to be on your awesome show.
Well, thank you, so kind. So I was going to say, mate, what is it you do?
So WildLifeWorks is a conservation company. We work in developing countries to protect wildlife, and our particular approach to conservation is providing livelihoods, alternative livelihoods for the local communities that live in the wilderness or around the wilderness, so that they have a real reason to keep the wildlife alive, and so that wildlife works for them as well as for us.
And what got you into this?
I had a company that I sold in the 90s, and I had always been a wildlife fan, a bunny hugger, if you want to call it that. So I promised myself I would go to Africa if I ever had any time and a little bit of money, and I would go and look at elephants. So I did, and I had the cliched epiphany in the bush, as they say, where I was struck by the magnificence of elephants and giraffes and zebras and all the other things, but I also couldn't help but notice that they were under a significant amount of threat.
And so what did you do from that point? What was your kind of next step?
You know, I had the idea of WildLifeWorks while I was on that trip, because it seemed very obvious to me that the traditional conservation response, which I was in a ecotourism facility at the time, and it had electric fences and it had rangers with guns, and I just thought, gee, you know, this doesn't look like my vision of conservation of wildlife. And what we call it now in our company, we call it the old-fashioned way of conservation. We call fence and shoot conservation, because people put up fences around wildlife and they shoot people when they come close. And I didn't think that, I'd never really thought about it in that way before I was seeing it firsthand, and it struck me that that was not the right answer morally or practically, given that, as we say, elephants don't vote. So it seemed pretty obvious that a solution that didn't work for local communities was not going to work for wildlife. So that was how I decided, coming out of that trip, that I would change my life path, career path, whatever you want to call it, everything path. And as it turns out, spend the next 23 years trying to figure out how to make wildlife work.
And so what was your the first step you went through? Because I've seen some videos where you set up an organization where the community, especially the women, could come in and design clothes and sell t-shirts. What was the strategy and thinking behind that?
The first place we went was Kenya, and the communities were subsistence farmers, essentially, so they didn't have a lot of opportunity that wasn't dependent on land, and the rainfall and was failing, and farming was becoming less and less practical, and they were needing more and more land, or they thought they needed more and more land just to overcome this declining productivity. So it was that conflict over land that gave us the idea that we really needed to pull people off the land and give them jobs that were not dependent on farming, on subsistence farming. And so that's how we started thinking. And we also had an early idea that we wanted to employ as many women as possible in the community, because traditionally they were not money earners in the community. Of course, they're like everywhere in the world, they're the glue that holds everything together, but they weren't in the wage jobs in Africa, so in Kenya. So what we knew was that we wanted to brand the wildlife and create value, and because that's what I knew from my business days, my management consulting days, is if you want to take value from one place and get somebody else to recognize that value and pay for it, you do it through branding. And so we wanted to create products that we could brand around the wildlife and the wilderness, and then sell them to people in the United States and in Europe that have the luxury to be able to think about brands and think about values and think about how they spend their money. So we looked at a bunch of different ideas. This, by the way, is before the Kyoto Protocol, so I'm sure this is going to come up. that nowadays our business model is quite different. But this activity that I'm describing when we started the company was before there was a Kyoto Protocol, which was the beginning essentially of the climate movement at scale in the world. And so we looked at different options. In the end, we built a rammed earth factory, a clothing factory out of earth in the bush, and we trained the local women to sew. And this was sort of a collaboration in terms of ideas between us and them, because they didn't really have any other skills or any other thoughts about their livelihood other than subsistence farming, because that's all they'd really ever known. So it was sort of a bit of a collaborative effort to figure out what they would be prepared to do and interested in doing and getting paid for, and then what we thought we could actually make a product out of and sell. So that's how we ended up making t-shirts, which we still make today, and sell them through the internet mostly. We do a lot of production from other companies as well, but we're the furthest thing from a clothing company. So we're not particularly good at selling clothing. But it does create really important jobs for the women in the community, and many of the women that were employed 22 years ago are still employed today. So and have put kids in school and university through their jobs. So it's been a big piece. It's been an important part of our story, but it's not the story today.
Okay, and this brings us to the carbon credits and REDD+. Can you tell us what that is, please?
Roughly somewhere between 15 and 20% of global emissions. So emissions are greenhouse gas emissions. People are probably familiar with that idea. So globally, we know roughly how many tons. Emissions are measured in the world that we work in tons of CO2 equivalent. So tons, there's about somewhere around 40 to 50 billion tons of emissions you'll hear that happen annually through all of our activities. So energy production and transportation and farming and everything. The total is in that order of magnitude. And of that, about between 15 and 20% is deforestation-related emissions. So it's a huge problem for the global climate, is the cutting down and destroying of forests, and so the UN, the United Nations, came up with this notion in between Kyoto. So at Kyoto, they didn't have this idea. It took them a few years after Kyoto to have this idea, really, or to mature this idea that they needed to really stop deforestation as a key factor. So just to give you some order of magnitude, deforestation emissions are larger than all the transportation emissions in the world. So all the cars, planes, trains, boats in the world make less emissions each year than deforestation does. And so the UN came up with this idea that they needed to really focus energy and attention on reducing emissions from deforestation. So they created this idea of REDD, R-E-D, and now it has another D, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. The second D is degradation. Deforestation is when you have a forest and it disappears, becomes a non-forest. Degradation is when you have a big forest and it becomes a small forest. So essentially that's a simple way of thinking about it, that trees are being cut and carbon is being lost, but it still looks like a forest. It just looks like a less impressive forest. So that's degradation. And that is also, in many countries, a very significant source of emissions, where there might still be a bit of a canopy that makes it look like forest. It still qualifies as forest under the UN definitions, but it's lost a lot of its carbon value because people have been taking logs out and using them for charcoal or building and things. So REDD, R-E-D-D, is the mechanism that the UN originated, and that allows projects or groups like myself, or countries for that matter, to make a claim that they're helping the climate by stopping deforestation. So if you can stop deforestation, you're reducing emissions from deforestation. And if you can quantify that, which you have to do if you want to be in this business, as a business, you have to be able to quantify how much you've stopped deforestation. And if you can do that, then you get given by international standards these carbon credits, they're called commonly. Each one represents 1 ton of emissions that you reduced from stopping deforestation. So each ton can be sold to a variety of places, from a consumer that wants to offset their flight to, of course, there's none of that going on right now. With a hypothetical consumer and a hypothetical flight in 2020, but all the way up to a company that has tried to change its business to reduce emissions as much as possible, but is stuck with what we call unavoidable emissions, because things that they can't be in business today based on either technological limitations or financial limitations. They couldn't be in business today and reduce all their own emissions. So they can compensate their emissions by paying us to reduce emissions somewhere else. Thank for us.
Okay, so for a community, an indigenous community or a government, if they bring WildLifeWorks in to support them, what is it that you guys do for them?
Yeah, so there's a technical element of it, of the work we do, that's quite technical, involves looking at satellite images to make the case that there was historical deforestation, and that then you on a going forward basis, you have to use satellite images to show that you've actually stopped the deforestation. So it's not a hypothetical, it's there was deforestation and now there isn't, or there's reduced. It doesn't have to be zero, but there's reduced deforestation. So there's a technical element which indigenous communities or local subsistence farming communities would not have the capacity to do. And then there's the alternative livelihood stuff. So whatever they're doing today, either themselves or whatever their forest is being subjected to by other people who are looking for livelihoods from the forest, we have to provide alternatives. We can't just tell them to stop. We have to provide a better way for them to feed their kids and put them through school. So the model for us is to work with them to design a small business, if you want to call it that protects the forest and protects the wildlife by training them to do so. So they're the people who are protecting the forest, not us. Us is them, really. In any project, we would normally have one person that isn't from the community that is organizing and hiring and bringing the knowledge in when it's needed from outside where it doesn't exist locally. But the rest of the people are generally from the community, and they're trained to do all the other jobs. So we make a deal with them, essentially, that if they can stop deforestation, if they agree to switch whatever it is they're doing that was causing deforestation, or if they agree to protect their forest against somebody else, if we finance their ability to protect their forest against outsiders, then we'll get these credits will get generated. We'll manage the process through the international standard of getting awarded the credits. We'll sell the credits. We'll go find customers for the credits. We'll sell it, and then we'll share the money with them, with the government, and of course enough to keep our company going at the same time.
And so for a company like Shell, how do they go about calculating how many credits that they need to buy from these projects?
Well, they have almost every company of any size, I would say, today in the world has a team of people, either internally or externally. In a case like Shell, it would definitely be internally because they have engineers and scientists, up the wazoo in Shell. So the science of calculating a company's emissions is not that difficult. It's quite well understood because the majority of emissions are from energy production or from transportation emissions or from agricultural fertilizers and things like that, those kinds of things. So companies are quite good at calculating their footprint, big ones especially. Little ones maybe not, but big ones are good at calculating it. So we don't really need to provide them any help there. And then the trick for a company is what is their strategy? They call them decarbonization strategies. So what is their strategy to reduce their carbon footprint as a company? And so that strategy usually has two major elements. It has how can they reduce their actual source emissions? How can they use less electricity? How can they use renewable energy to fuel what they're doing? How can they travel less or travel travel less or travel with more efficient transportation? How can they avoid using chemical fertilizers and things that produce a huge amount of emissions if they're in the ag business? So the first step is within their own business. How do they reduce the emissions that they can? And that is usually just either process or or investment that they have to make in alternative sources of energy for their own business. But then secondly, all companies have things that go on outside of their four walls. So all companies have customers and suppliers, and those activities happen outside the four walls of the company. And so responsible companies are also looking at what responsibility they bear for any emissions associated with serving their customers or with acquiring the products that they sell. So that's where we come in, because they can't actually reduce this. It's not inside their four walls. They can't reduce those emissions because it's not part of their company. So they can only influence what happens outside their four walls, or they can compensate for it through buying carbon credits from a project like ours that's reducing the emissions from deforestation.
And is it a legal requirement, or is it going to be a legal requirement for these companies to purchase these credits to offset their pollution?
It's not a global requirement yet. One of the hopes behind the Paris Agreement was that there would be some global legislation, global regulation. I don't think that's likely, to be honest. I think just because the UN is not really a regulatory body, it doesn't have any sovereignty in any country in order to impose penalties, if you like, for not following rules. So there are some. So it really what's happening is regulation is happening country by country, or maybe region by region. So regulation is happening in Europe. It's happened fast in Europe. There's a lot of regulation in Europe about forcing certain industry sectors to reduce their emissions. There's a lot less in the United States, but it's coming, or was coming faster than it is under this administration, but it's certainly coming. The companies in the United States are now fully aware of the same issues. It's already in Asia, China, Japan, Korea, these are all, India, all countries that are taking climate very seriously and are making regulations within their own economy to require or compel certain sectors of their industries to reduce their emissions. And usually it's the heavy emission sectors, so it's energy, it's oil and gas, chemicals, it's transportation, cement, steel. These are the sectors of industry that have relatively huge footprints.
And from your own projects, can you give us an example of one that you're actually working on, and the kind of money that is involved the communities can expect to receive for protecting their forests?
Yeah, so we've been working longest in Kenya. That's where we started, and our Kenyan project is financed by carbon now, close to 100%, absent the T-shirts that we sell, and so that project generates about 1.5 million tons of reduction. So in other words, had that project not existed, then the emissions from the continuing clearing of forest in Kenya to support this increasingly poor sustainable agriculture, or increasingly unsustainable agriculture because of climate change, those emissions were about 1.5 million tons a year. So we, by stopping that and by giving the community alternatives, and by proving that we've done so, and proving that we've done so working with the community. So that's part of our process, that the international auditors have to be convinced that the community is a partner in the process and not being forced to participate in a project. So by doing that, we generate about 1.5 million tons a year. The market rate for those tons is somewhere between $6 and $10, depending on who the customer is. So as a overall program, we generate, somewhere in the order of $10 million a year from that project. Now, that project touches about 120,000 people. So that's how many community members are engaged one way or another in the project. Not as direct employees. We have about 450 direct staff in Kenya now that are employed to do a variety of things from the community. But the economic benefits to the community as a whole are pretty dramatic relative to the benefits that they were getting from slash and burn subsistence agriculture. And so the majority of the money stays in the community. Some goes to, depending on which country we're working in. We now work in a number of countries. We started in Kenya, but we like the model so much we decided to use it again in the Congo. So we have a very large project in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we manage 8 projects in Colombia, working with indigenous groups and Afro-Caribbean groups that have their own land tenure. but have no financing to protect their land from external threats. So that's the model in Colombia. And then we are involved in a project in Cambodia to help the government there protect the largest intact forest block in Southeast Asia.
That's amazing. So for these communities, this is a significant amount of money for them. I mean, what kind of process do you go through? I mean, you don't just drop a check and say, there you go, there's $5 million or $10 million. What's that process like?
That process starts at the very beginning of a project. So in the case of Kenya 20 years ago, in establishing a mechanism, a governance mechanism for the community to absorb money, because many of these communities have never had any kind of really outside money. Literally the largest outside money that this community in Kenya had received from the conservation community, I'm not talking about maybe jobs in cattle or farming, but from the conservation, in terms of a conservation thing, was $10,000 grant. So they'd only ever had a $10,000 grant before, and so they hadn't really ever addressed what they were going to do with, if they ever did get a bunch of money. And so that's really one of the keys of our work, is to establish a good governance mechanism within the community that honors their culture, but also includes representation from youth and from women and from elders and from the elected leadership, so that they have quite a cross fertilization of ideas and representation of the various sectors of their community. So that governance body then, and then the other trick, which they themselves knew, is don't give them the money, because it's a lot of money that none of them have ever had or seen, and it's too much temptation in some ways. So don't give them the money. Let them make decisions about how that money gets spent. They want to build a school over there, but don't hand them the money to go build a school, because they don't know how to build a school. We go find them somebody who knows how to build a school, and then we pay that company or individual to build the school, and the community gets the school they wanted with the allocation of money. So it's a governance system that has evolved, and that they're in control of that. So they have established the operating procedures now, and they can change them. They have a board of directors within this community now. They can make changes to their operating procedure if they decide they've made mistakes and they want to do something differently. So that governance of how money flows in the community is very important to the work we do. And it's not rocket science, to be honest. I mean, in the end, the communities around the world like education. It doesn't matter where you are. They like education because it supports their children for a better life and a better future. They need food security, so if they can invest in better food security, they'll do that. They need healthcare, so if they can invest in better healthcare locally, better outcomes, they'll do that. In a place like Kenya, it's very dry. They need water so that they can support their existing farms better. So they need water to support their existing farms, because rainfall is much more erratic than it used to be because of climate change. So there's a model that we bring to every project which looks at all these different dimensions of livelihood. But the communities know what they need. They know what their own priorities are. So we don't work on their priorities. They tell us what their priorities are.
Have you seen over the years any kind of downside from a sudden influx of money?
Not really, not materially in the project. Again, because we have a lot of people involved in our projects, we're not talking about, in many cases, not all cases, some cases we do work with relatively small indigenous communities, but where it's a smaller project, it's smaller money, because the scale of the funding is in the way that the mechanism works. It scales bigger with a big project and smaller with a small project. So I would say, politics gets more interested, the politicians get more interested, the more money you see in the community, so that's always a risk. They would ignore you until there's money, and then they show up like bad pennies. But that's not a unique aspect to our work in the developing countries. We think that probably happens here too. Not really. I mean, I think you're not talking about, at an individual level, you're not talking about a handout that would change their life. What you're talking about is transforming the community. So you're talking about communities making investments in things that benefit the whole community. And those things tend to be quite expensive, building schools and building clinics and paying doctors and buying medicine and things. And so that money, even large money in a community of 120,000 people, it changes the community forever, but and thereby it changes the individuals. But they're still farming. They just now farm, and they don't have to worry about where the school fees are coming from, because the project can pay school fees, and they don't have to worry about what happens if somebody gets sick, or what happens if somebody has a failure of their crops and things like that.
So for the communities, is there any concern at all from where they receive the money from?
Not much, I'll be honest with you. I think it depends. Certainly with truly indigenous communities in the Amazon, for example, or in South America, then yes, I'd say they're the ones who, of any communities that we deal with, have been most vocal about wanting to know who's buying the credits and wanting to have a say in that. But they're fairly unusual in that regard. I would say it's not been a big thing for communities we work with, and certainly not in Africa, where you have much higher poverty or much lower standard of living in the kinds of remote places we work in Africa than anywhere else really in the world. So I haven't seen it there. Of course, we as a company have to have our own ethics about who we will do business with and whether we think that's appropriate or not. And that it is a challenge in that regard, because the idea here is that if you're a saint and you have no emissions, then you can't be my customer. And frankly, nobody has no emissions. It's impossible, because we breathe CO2. We're climate polluting machines, humans. But it is true that there are companies that are doing more to try and resolve their climate impact than some that are doing less. And we as a company are aware of that, and we as a company will discuss those issues with communities if they express an interest. But our experience has been they feel like they really need the money so badly in these rural communities that it's somewhat of an unfair expectation to expect them to be too picky about where it comes from, is being our observation. So we can put it in front of them and say, what about this? What about that? Are you comfortable here? Are you comfortable there? And as I said, the only place where we've really had a significant dialogue about that is with indigenous communities in the Amazon.
And what would you say is the size of the carbon credit market futuristically? Broadly, there are 40 to 50 billion tons a year of emissions, and we're on the wrong trajectory, by the way, in case anybody is not aware of that. This idea that we have to stop and protect our climate. We're still going in the wrong direction. We need to be going that way with our emissions, and we're still going that way with our emissions, right? And so, despite the Paris Agreement and all the pledges and all the work people like us do, we take an individual place, a forest that's going like this in emissions, and we make it go like that, down to zero. But on a global level, we're still going like this. So we're still going up, and so we've got a lot of work to do. But that means that theoretically, until we fix the problem and get rid of those emissions, there is a significant market. Let's say, in the billions of tons a year is the potential market for these carbon credits from a variety of sources, whether it be the kind of work we do or other types of project that reduce emissions. So and in the work we do, you could probably say it's. Not all deforestation is addressable, of course. We'd like to think it is, but it's probably not. So in practical terms, the market size for our market is probably in the 2 to 3 billion tons a year market. So times $5, times a range between $5 and $10 is somewhere between 10 and $30 billion a year is sort of the market range for the work we do. And of course, we're just a tiny little piece of that. And for a corporation that's wanting to buy carbon credits, what advice would you give them if they're shopping around?
I think not all carbon is created equal. So there's this idea in science that 1 ton of emissions is 1 ton of emissions is 1 ton of emissions, and therefore 1 ton of emission reductions is the same. And that's a good scientific principle, and it's been very helpful in allowing comparisons of the effectiveness of one approach to protecting the climate versus another approach to protecting the climate, because you can see which one is better at, and you're measuring the same output, the same result. So that's been helpful. What's not helpful is thinking of all carbon credits as a commodity, because some carbon credits come from protecting rainforest, and if you protect rainforest, you get all kinds of co-benefits, we call them. So you get benefits to biodiversity because you protect the habitat in which the wildlife lives, and in our case we also protect the wildlife itself, because in places like Kenya people like to shoot elephants, sadly, not Kenyan people always, but and so we have to protect the elephants in the forest, not just the forest. So you get a biodiversity benefit if you're protecting the area, and you also get a community benefit because the communities develop sustainably in a way that is much better than the path that they were on in terms of their ability to support their children and the future of their families. So those carbon credits are hard to produce and expensive to try and counteract the influence of, let's say, large cattle influences that are trying to deforest, or large palm oil companies that are trying to deforest. These are the big actors that take land for away from forest and wilderness typically. So that can be really expensive compared to, say, I don't know, a solar panel, which is not that expensive. You put up a solar panel and it's still reducing emissions because it's now producing electricity from the sun instead of from fossil fuels, but there's no co-benefit. There's no biodiversity benefit or community benefit. So I think what we talk to companies about is, if you really want to have a high impact as a company, and in particular these days companies are very influenced by this thing called the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which are another United Nations initiative that is very broad-based and is an attempt to define targets for the world to do better, basically, to put it, can we do better at reducing poverty? Can we do better at providing fair and quality education? Can we do better at providing healthcare on a fair and uniform basis? So the Sustainable Development Goals have been developed within the UN, and companies are very enthusiastic about them. So our projects tend to address most of the Sustainable Development Goals, whereas many other types of carbon credit project would not. So I think there is some advantage in dealing with rainforests. You get elephants too.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so for the carbon credit markets as a whole, do you have any concerns about the future or any recommendations?
I think it's a necessary look. As long as we're a market-based society, which we are everywhere, then market-based solutions, I think, have a role in solving our problems moving forward. Now, regulation is also important. Policy is also important. You need to create the right guardrails for the marketplace to make sure that it does the right thing in moving forward. But I think market-based solutions are very important, and especially here where you're talking about moving wealth really to these forest communities who have no other way of attracting wealth, right? And wealth, I don't mean wealth just in money, because many of these communities, they don't necessarily value the money, but the money gets them things like education and healthcare and food security and other things that are important. So it isn't not about money. Let's put it that way. So I think a market-based solution is a good solution to allow big companies that have a lot of wealth that are trying to reduce their footprint as much as they can, but that in today's society cannot reduce it all the way. If they want to be carbon neutral, there's no other way to do it, frankly, than to offset some portion of their footprint or compensate for some portion of their footprint. So I think market-based solutions are here to stay. I think they will continue to evolve and grow as pressure grows. Unfortunately, because we're still on the wrong trajectory with emissions globally, I think the pressure is just going to keep getting bigger and bigger to stop, and the value of doing the work we do to stop emissions from deforestation is just going to keep going up. I hope, we hope, because that's going to mean that the market expands, and that when the market expands in our world, that means more forests are being protected. More forests are being protected, and more communities are being served. More biodiversity is being saved. So that's what my aspiration is behind the market, and And it's, it was looking great, frankly. I mean, everything was going swimmingly, and then something happened this year. Something happened this year that definitely, caused everybody to take pause. But in the end, the global emissions will not be permanently reduced because of this, unless we continue new action to stop traveling and stop using fossil fuels and other things that we've done, that we've had to stop doing during the pandemic. But my feeling is that as a society we'll unfortunately we'll get back on the wagon before we get off it again. That's the summary, I suppose. We're going to get back on that wagon because that's the wagon that we know, and in times of crisis people gravitate to what they know. So I suspect things will pick up in our world. Will pick up again, hopefully, as the economies around the world wake up and go back to work.
And for you on a personal level, I mean, we've had the forest fires here in California. I mean, your own home has, becoming under risk at one point, and you've had the fires in Kenya. What's that like for you, and kind of what's your outlook?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be with us for a while. I think these fires are going to be with us for a while. I don't think, there's certainly special circumstances that led to this year being a particularly bad year, both here in California and in Kenya. But those circumstances are becoming less special because of climate change, right? So extremes of climate, extremely wet winter, which means there's more fuel in a forest, which means and then an extremely dry summer, which means that it all dries out and is like a tinderbox. I mean, those extremes are with us to stay because of climate change. I think the unique elements that have sparked fires in California, for example, these dry lightning storm that happened this year, that historically was a once in a few decades occurrence, very rare that you get lightning where there's no rain. And so but again, with climate, you can't say that any of these weird things that are happening are likely not to happen again, because they are a symptom of climate change. And so anyways, my outlook is that it's not going to get much better. That we're going to be dealing with fire in the summer in California forever, I think, until we've made a dramatic change in the climate impact of our human activity. There's some things we can do to mitigate the risk for people, of course, and those things can be done with more investment in preparation. But I think that's likelihood. In Kenya, fire is it's a weapon. So people who are opposed to the protection of forest and wildlife. So who's that? It's the people that would rather use the land to make money. So not the communities per se, but the politicians and maybe big corporate interests that might want the land. Fire is a bit of a weapon there. They know in a dry spell they can set fire, and they know that the country has very little capacity to fight fire. So our teams in Kenya have been on the front line of probably 50 or 60 fires in the last 2 months in Kenya, in the national park, as well as in our project area, and as well as in the community, because fire is indiscriminate. It doesn't care. Somebody wanted to burn a bit of wilderness to clear some land for their cows, and the wind picks up, and next thing you know, it's heading for a school, right? So a lot of what we've been doing is also helping to protect the communities from fire. And I honestly don't see that being much different. Whether nature can help, of course, when there's fog in California, it helps, or when there's rainfall in Kenya. But the seasonal patterns of rainfall have changed dramatically. So I'm not hopeful that problem will go away anytime soon. I think is the long and the short of it. I think we waited too long to act on climate change, unfortunately, to avoid some of these consequences, but unfortunately we're just scratching the surface. So we really need to get moving and moving fast on climate if we're going to avoid much worse consequences than hurricanes and tornadoes and forest fires.
That brings me to the next question. As for a member of the public, what concrete action steps can they take? What would you recommend?
I mean, all of our responsibility begins with us, right? So each of us have an individual responsibility to think about our own life and our own footprint on the earth, and to think about buying sustainable goods and using our dollars that we do spend to vote for better products that are climate neutral, or products that are organic, and that are regenerative, that are restoring soil and things. So we all have a personal responsibility. And then the other thing we can all influence, of course, is government, because government is supposed to be a reflection of our beliefs. And so if we get a government that's opposed to climate change, shame on us. That's a reflection that not enough of us care about this issue. And so you can vote. That's the other thing you can do, is you can vote based on what the candidates are saying about climate change. If you believe that climate change is a significant issue that needs to be a high priority for the country.
And another question, please, for someone, or for a young person, or someone that's like yourself is going to make a career change later on in life, what advice would you give those?
So, a young person or somebody like me?
Oh, you're still young, mate.
Thanks for that. Well, yeah, look, I mean, again, young people have more power than they imagine, right? Number one, we all know they're the future, right? That's a truism. They're the future. They'll be around long after we are. And so they're going to inherit this mess. So they should care more than everybody else in a way, because they're going to have a whole life that is dealing with this issue, whereas we've only been dealing with it for a decade or two of our lives. But they're going to live their entire life dealing with this issue of climate. So in a way, they should be more passionate and more caring about it. And they have tremendous influence over their elders in their own family, I think, among other places. And then, of course, once they're old enough, they can also vote. And once they join the workforce, and now one of the things that we're seeing is that the millennials are now moving into the I won't say middle age, but into the age where they're acquiring things and investing in things with their accumulated wealth, and it is producing a shift away from investing in things that are bad for the planet and towards a desire, at least, to invest in things that are good for the planet. Now, there may not be enough investments out there yet that are good for the planet, because it's a shift that is in transition right now. But so I think that does make me optimistic, is that not just that they care more, because I think they do and they should, but that they're doing more as well, and that they're engaged. So I see the ones who are engaged. I don't, because they seek us out and talk to us and ask for our internships and other things. But so I don't see that there may be a huge number of them out there who are despairing that there's just nothing that can be done. But certainly that's not true. There's always something that can be done. There's always a worse outcome if we don't act, no matter when we start acting. So the sooner we act and the more we do, the better outcome we're going to have. And I think that's the message to young people, is that there's a lot that is within their power. And we need their energy and their enthusiasm and their youth.
Okay, and then what about a person my age? If I was looking for a career change, what would...
You already did, mate. Another one? I think this economic shift, right, away from a carbon-based economy to a non-carbon-based economy, or a carbon-light economy, that's going to require lots of transformation of jobs, right, and lots of rethinking. But engineers are still engineers. Engineers are still going to need to be engineers. Doctors are still going to need to be doctors. Educators are still going to need to be educators. So within reason, the society that we're moving towards will look a lot like the one we have now. The difference is we have to think about really where in those intense carbon-intensive industries, that we cannot afford to perpetuate. So how do we build things with steel that doesn't require huge amounts of energy, that force us to use fossil fuels, right? Things like that. Cement, huge amounts of energy. How do we move those products and those needs of society in a different way? And what jobs does that create? Renewable energy, distributing renewable energy across the planet is going to be a huge undertaking in the next few decades, and it was going to create a lot of new jobs. So I think there's going to be a lot of new opportunities with the same skills. With many of the same skills, people will be able to move. There's going to be disruption in the workforce, no question, as we move ahead. And I think as a society, we have to really focus on those members of the workforce who are going to be potentially disadvantaged and find solutions for them. If we want their political support in this movement, then we need to find solutions for them that don't make them the victims of a solution that works for everybody else.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And just, I'm just curious, is there anything else that you'd like to share?
Well, I guess there are there's many other things that are in the details of what we do. I'm sure you're going to share our website with people. They can find out more about what we do. We also participate in a site where individuals can offset their footprint by buying credits from conservation projects around the world, and that site's called Stand for Trees, and that's a place where it's set up to be very consumer friendly. And yeah, no, I think you've covered a huge amount of what we do without getting into any of the gory details. And I appreciate the time, and wish you the best of luck with this and with your other endeavors.
Well, thanks, Mike, and it's a real pleasure to connect with you. And again, thank you for doing what you do. And I'm just we're gonna close this interview. We're gonna show a short video for the viewers to watch on your Congo project. And one of the phrases in that is towards the end, one of the community members points out that they can support one generation by chopping a tree down, but you can support many generations by keeping that tree alive. And I think that's a very kind of encapsulates what you're doing.
The wisdom is already there.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you, Mike. Once again, take care, mate.
Okay. Cheers now.
Congo Basin rainforest, one of the most amazing places on planet Earth, lives some of the sweetest people that I have ever met. They still live in a way that they have lived for hundreds of years. It's a community where the electricity have not yet arrived. Their home is the second largest intact rainforest in the world and one of the most significant wetlands on the planet. This forest is one of the most important forests in the fight to halt climate change. A fight that they have nothing to do with, but they hold the key for a solution and they are prepared to fight with us. This is one of the least developed places on our planet. A place where people still live connected to Mother Earth. In many ways, this is a paradise, but the wisdom of the trees holds a dark history. These kind people have been taken advantage of from colonial days until modern times, with logging companies destroying their home in the name of profit. I wouldn't be surprised if they chased me away when I arrived, but instead they embraced me with open arms. When I talked with the elders, they told me stories about their childhood, when the forest was full of animals and the lake full of fish. Days when the people were happy and had food to eat. Bonobos, forest elephants, and other today endangered species were their neighbors. When the logging companies came, they completely ignored the health of the community and the wildlife, leaving little to no economic benefit to the people. They made so much noise and created terror that scared the animals away and destroyed their natural habitat. But everything changed in 2008, following a governmental revision of the DRC National Forest Code. 91 of 156 logging concessions were suspended in an effort to address corruption in the sector. It was at this time that WildLifeWorks implemented the RED+ conservation strategy to prevent 2 of the logging concessions from being restored to logging. In collaboration with the community of 180,000 people living in the 300,000 hectare project area and the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo, they agreed upon using carbon finance to address the community's health, education, and economic development needs. The community decides how to use the money they receive in the best way, and the decisions are made in a democratic manner with substantial representation of women. Since the project launched in 2011, Logging has halted, and today WildLifeWorks employs over 130 people from the project area, providing effective capacity building support so they can improve the conditions in their community. And together they are building new schools and renovating old schools, training people in organic gardening, introducing crop intensification and more nutritious produce to alleviate the pressure on the local wildlife. Programs are currently being planned to repopulate the lake with fish, supplying vaccines to stop epidemics and building medical clinics. Former hunters are now foresters, teaching the community about the importance of the trees. The biodiversity team is monitoring how bonobos and forest elephants are coming back into the project area, and the animals thrive in harmony with nature. Revenue generated from the sales of carbon credits not only conserve this beautiful and important tropical rainforest, it also empowers the community while preserving their traditional spiritual and cultural values. Everywhere I went, people had great hope for the future and faith in WildLifeWorks. They understand that they can either support one generation with the trees cut down, or support many generations in the future if they keep the trees standing. The people living in the Maindombe project area are protecting this precious forest for the benefit of everyone. They now invite corporate leaders to join them in their mission and together protect the earth for future generations.
Hi, my name's Kirsty. If you enjoyed the content today and would like to watch more videos like this, please subscribe to our social media channels or join us at www.f.live/join.